My name is Willow Hozella, and I'm one of the facilitators here. In the back of the room, there are some other facilitators. We have red staff things on our name badges. If you have any questions, concerns, or requests, please don't hesitate to find one of us. Just a couple of quick announcements. The exhibit hall will be open until 5 o'clock today. There are 2 quiet rooms available, 113 and 114 on the first floor. There is a nursing room available in room 116, and in room 115 there's the Patent Podcast. If any of you have stories you'd like to share, anything like that, comments about the conference, please stop by room 115. They're trying to get sort of a collection of audience feedback to put on the podcast. The closing keynote by Janet Twyman, Why Be a Behavioral Educator, will be at 4:30 in the President's Hall. And please remember that to get continuing education credits, you have to complete and hand in your verification forms with the codes on it. You'll get the code at the end of this session. And anybody who needs social work credits, please remember to sign in and out each day. It's important that you do that. So, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Dave Palmer. One of the really wonderful things about this conference is you get to see these like giants in the field, and they present for 3 hours rather than say just 50 minutes or so. And Dave's one of my favorite presenters. It's phenomenal, the conceptual analysis and the sort of witty, urbane approach to explaining these very esoteric concepts is really appreciated. So thank you very much, Dave. And
thanks, Willa. So this is a little bit different. Behavioral interpretation of mathematics and logic at a conference devoted to autism. I think Mike Miklos, who sort of runs the conference, got sick of me eating all the free food at the conference and hanging around, gawking in the corridors, and said, I'll fix his wagon. This year I'll have him talk about something he has no idea what to say. So it worked in the sense that I had no idea what I was going to say, but it didn't keep me from coming. So to that extent, it failed. I taught college for 40 years now, and 35 of those years I spent teaching statistics, along with behavior analysis. But my primary function was to teach statistics because every psychology major had to take this class, so there was a big demand for it. And behavior analysis was an elective, so I would have small behavior analysis classes and big statistics classes. So that's my only claim to fame for mathematical expertise. But it did give me some insights in how to think about it. So what's a behavioral interpretation? Well, this is something I'm better able to talk about. A behavioral interpretation is explaining some phenomena or some phenomenon in terms of the principles of behavior and nothing else. So when it comes to mathematics and logic, we're going to try to ask what are the behavioral processes involved in acquiring the skills and using the skills, and make no appeal to things like mathematical ability or intuition or intelligence and the other kinds of things that are in common parlance when we think about math and logic. It's not that those things are meaningless, it's that they're not behavioral, they're not interpreted in behavioral terms. So we want to confine ourselves to behavioral processes to see to what extent we can account for the phenomenon without bringing in other stuff. Maybe we have to bring in other stuff. We never really know until we try. So in this context, it means identifying the reinforcement contingencies that bring behavior under the control of quantitative variables and are led to the development of these formal rules and so on. And perhaps that facilitate the teaching of math and logic. By the way, my slides are quite busy with text as prompts for me because I don't have well-developed interverbals on this subject. This is close to the first time I have talked about this to an audience of this sort. And so I don't have a lot of canned responses at my fingertips. So I depend on my slides a lot. You don't need to read them. There's nothing on those slides that you're going to have to, except for half a dozen, where it will be helpful to read them. So they're prompts to myself. You can ignore them if you like. Okay, so why do we care? And I would be willing to bet $5 that you don't care. At least you didn't care until you saw the thing in the blurb of the conference. That is, you probably never thought about it. Why do we care about a behavioral interpretation of math? Well, the better we understand it, the better we can engineer the behavior in ourselves or others. And math and logic are commonly difficult for people. So understanding the behavioral processes may help us be better teachers or better at the task for ourselves. So I want to start by getting some mathematical behavior out of you. And I'm going to go around the room to each person and ask you a mathematical question. And you're going to tell me the answer. And I'll tell you whether it's right or wrong. And I may probe you for a little more information. For example, I might say, is 83 a prime number? And you'll say, yes, because it's not evenly divisible by any other number less than 83, so it's a prime number. I might say, is the square root of 190 an integer? You'd think for a bit, and you'd say, no, it can't be an integer because 13 squared is 169, and 14 squared is 196, and it lies between those two, so it can't be an integer. Oh, wait a minute, I forgot to tell you. I left out an important word. The word is not. I'm not going to go around and ask each of you a question. Under no conditions will I ask anyone in this room to provide an answer to a mathematical question. If you raise your hand, I'll be happy to call on you. So why this little gag? What I do want you to do is raise your hand if you felt any anxiety. Yeah. Right. Now, what about math phobia? Would any of you describe yourselves as really anxious about math? Not anymore. not now that you know that you're not going to be called that. Okay. Well, I was teaching classes to students who were forced to take statistics because it was a requirement. And I would ask this question at the beginning of the semester, and about a third of the class would confess to having what they would call math anxiety. Maybe phobia is too strong a word, but they would say math anxiety. And the question is, where does this math anxiety come from? And so I would kind of probe for answers to that question, and the answers I got were terrifying. Let me tell you about one. Her name is, I'll call her Tanya. Since it's being televised, I don't want her calling me up angrily, saying I've outed her. She told a story about when she was in elementary school, and the teacher said, we're going to play a math game, and we're going to divide up 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, and the ones are going to be the Boston Red Sox, and the twos are going to be the New York Yankees. And I'm going to, when you're at bat, I'm going to ask you a question, and if you get it right, you go to first base, and if there's someone on first base, that person goes to second base, and so on. This will be fun, fun, fun. Well, Tanya was lousy at arithmetic, and she was petrified of this game. And when it came her turn to be at bat, the bases were loaded, the squares was tied. I don't know if this is true, but anyway, I'm embellishing a little bit. And Tanya's asked her question, and she gets it wrong. And how do you think the other children on her team responded? Did they say, oh, Tanya, that's okay, we don't really care about this game? Not a bit of it. Oh, God! and you know, the next time she came out to be at bat, people would be saying, "Oh no, 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 no." So imagine the humiliation for this kid. So math is often associated with humiliation. Go to the board, little Davy Palmer, and you know, compute something. And so little Davy Palmer pulls up his Lord Fauntleroy shorts and goes to the board with his chalk and gets the thing wrong. And in front of the whole classroom has to go back, having failed. So failure is the root of this anxiety we feel with respect to mathematics. So I wanted to get that out of the way early, because whatever else I say is trivial in comparison to this point. If you were a teacher of math, or really any other subject, but math in particular, I think is prone to this, because the answer is either right or wrong, and it's hard to say, well, that's close. The failure is conspicuous in mathematics, and it leads to this paralyzing effect where when you're asked a math problem, instead of jumping into mathematical behavior, you start to get all tense, which competes with the target behavior we're looking for. So to the extent that you have any role as a teacher of mathematics, be scrupulous about avoiding those opportunities for failure and humiliation. I mean, failure is fine as long as it's not associated with any kind of judgment. So that's just a homily that has very little to do with the rest of my talk. Kinds of quantitative behavior. Nonverbal behavior under the control of quantitative variables. So I live on an old farm, and I move a lot of rocks. In my spare time between giving talks at the National Autism Conference, the other 11 months of the year, I'm prying rocks out of the ground. And I've discovered, as many have before me, that if you want to move a rock, you got to have a lever, and the bigger the lever, the better. My daughter carries around in her trunk a pipe that's about 2 feet long. And the reason she carries a pipe about 2 feet long is that she got a flat tire once and couldn't get the lug nuts off her wheel. And she, of course, discovered that if you put an extension on the lug nut wrench, a puny little spindly young woman can free up any lug nut on Earth, no matter how hard it was put on, using the sun as a clock and so on. These are nonverbal responses that we have with respect to time and distance and force and so on, and weight. Then we have verbal behavior under the control of quantitative variables, rule-governed behavior. So rule-governed behavior happens when some contingency-shaped behavior, like figuring out that a lever is useful for moving rocks, gets passed on to someone else as a verbal instruction. If you want to move that big rock over there, get a big lever, and get the fulcrum down near the toe of the lever, and you'll be able to move that rock. But mathematics, as a system, is a set of rules specifically for modeling and quantifying nature. They're examples of verbal behavior. They are shaped up by the verbal community with arbitrary, the verbal community establishes the reinforcement contingency for the mathematical rules. That is, a pre-verbal child might understand in some sense that 1 + 1 = 2, but would not know the interverbal chain 1 + 1 = 2. Logic is a set of analogous rules and systems, except that it's confined to verbal statements, propositions, whereas mathematics concerns numbers of things, logic concerns verbal statements. So, and as verbal behavior, logic and math can guide other behavior. So how much math do you need to know? Well, it's practical contingencies. Managing time and distance. You're supposed to meet someone at 6 o'clock and they live 40 miles away. You have to plan out your day a little bit to figure out if you're going to get there on time and how long it will take you and so on. Cooking. Something as simple as cooking. Well, following a recipe doesn't require much in the way of math, but if you want to double a recipe or triple a recipe or quintuple a recipe, then you've got to bring some math into the game. Now, grandmother probably never used a cookbook in her life. She knew that you could throw in a handful of flour and a pinch of salt and taste it a little bit. But I've made some real boners in my cooking days, few though they were. I mixed up tablespoons and teaspoons when it came to red pepper in a recipe. And boy, was that a mistake. Well, we had to throw that whole thing out. Well, that's, how much cooking do people do? Well, fair bit. Handling money is obviously the big one. How much does it cost? What's its value? Which is a better deal? Do I have enough money? What's a 20% tip? What's a 15% discount? How much can I live on? Then these questions like long-term things, how much do I need for retirement, and what kind of return can I get on this investment, and so on. All that requires at least some conceptual understanding of quantity, but usually it requires more than that, some actual arithmetic and so on. Weighing risks and probabilities, solving problems of everyday life, like splitting the bill and so on, figuring out the score in a ball game. What about social contingencies? Well, advancing through school, getting into college. Colleges typically scrutinize your SAT scores and so on. Not to mention your high school grades. Getting certain types of job. You're not going to get a job as an engineer if you're completely math illiterate. Avoiding embarrassment. Now, for most of us, this is not a small thing. That is, we don't like to confess to people how little we know about mathematics, and it's nice to be able to do something, get something right in front of other people. Looking smart. We like to strut a little bit when we get something right, and maybe other people don't. The trouble with looking smart is that it means someone else has to look stupid in comparison, and that's probably not a good thing. But in any case, these are sort of the reasons people like to know some math. I mean, the looking smart bit. I think a kid who's really good at math in first grade because he watched Sesame Street or something gets to jog around the playground a little bit with his chest puffed out. And as a consequence, when the next easy math lesson comes along, that kid is sitting in the front row working hard at it, and is good at that too. And then in second grade is good because he was kind of at the head of the class in first grade, and second grade and third grade, and it grows and grows and grows and grows, where this child is getting a lot of attention and reinforcement for being good at math, and so is always prepared for the next step in the ladder. Whereas the kid at the other end of the scale, who's perhaps absolutely every bit as good in terms of intellectual horsepower as the first, was out with measles the day fractions were taken up, and then when the next lesson came along, was unprepared for it and failed, and that led to avoidance, which led to further falling behind and so on. So these things, I don't know. Looking smart is a double-edged sword. Okay, well, on my way down to this conference, I came down with my wife, and I said, you know, these days, people don't need to know stinking math because they have cell phones. And she said, no. That's baloney. You still need to know a lot of math. And I don't know what her argument was because I wasn't listening to her. I was trying to force my argument on her. But it is true that these days money isn't quite as salient a variable as it was because people pull out their plastic and shove it in the machine, and they don't really notice the quantitative nature of the transaction so much. And if you need to know the answer to something, you ask Alexa, oh, Alexa, by the way, what's 27, what's the square root of 190? And Alexa says, it's between 13 and 14, David. And then you get the question right. So anyway, I don't know how all the technology of today is going to affect the teaching of kids of tomorrow. This is beyond my pay grade, but it does seem to me that the contingencies are changing in our culture. So the pathways to mathematical skills, they can be taught, you can learn it online. Very few people learn directly from books, but some people do. Without any opportunity to learn in classrooms, they still turn to books and are able to learn. And then these other things. So let's go back to the mathematics of raw nature at the beginning. So in nonverbal organisms, is there any mathematics in nonverbal organisms? Well, not in the sense of verbal behavior. And if I say that mathematics is verbal behavior, which I do, nonverbal organisms don't have it. But they do have sensitivity to quantitative variables. There's both innate, and with organisms that don't live very long, most of it has to be innate. But some of it is acquired as well. So number, even pigeons can be taught to discriminate small numbers from other numbers, 1 from 2 to 3, and so on. Probably by a sort of a visual apprehension rather than count. Certainly they don't count, but they can discriminate three dots from 2 dots. So they can discriminate quantity. Pigeons can discriminate time and a differential reinforcement of low rate schedule. You can get a pigeon to time its behavior up to around 10 seconds or so. That is, you can make the pigeon pause between pecks for. They're pretty good at 1 second and 2 seconds and 3 seconds. They get lousier and lousier as the duration goes on. But pigeons are terrific at navigating. So somehow they're tuned into the azimuth, the direction to north, so that they can home and they can migrate and so on. And size. Animals are clearly sensitive to size. Our cat is an indoor-outdoor cat, and she gets in a fight with a cat outside. She comes in the house, and her tail is puffed up like a raccoon's tail, this piloerection. The hairs on her tail stick straight out, and it's funny as heck, but the point is, this was selected by natural selection. Why? To make her look big, so the other cat will think twice about picking a fight with her. So clearly, cats are sensitive to size, but they're also sensitive to distance. The stalking behavior of a cat, they stalk and they stalk and they stalk, then they strike. So their sensitivity to distance is something which is, again, clearly has a strong innate component. Nest building, rearing of young, and so on. Allocating resources, storing resources. Now, this selected behavior, natural selection contingencies tend to be fairly rough and ready. That is, a tail doesn't have to increase in size by 3.14159 inches to be effective at deterring an attack, it just has to be bigger. And natural selection does not make sharp requirements, quantitative requirements of that sort, because the natural contingencies are kind of loose. And I'm going to give an example of the language of bees. Many of you, probably all of you know that bees have a way of communicating with one another. If they are out foraging for nectar and they stumble on a big field of clover, they gobble it up and go back to the hive and inform the hive mates that there's good feeding to be had out there. And it will, if the sun is in the same direction as the clover, the bee will fly straight up the face of the hive, wiggling its butt as it goes. That's why it's called the waggle dance. But if the clover is, say, 22 degrees, well, 20 is over to the right of the sun, then it might fly like line A there. That is, it will fly at an angle to the vertical, which is roughly equal to the angle of the clover from the sun. If the clover is further to the right, then the waggle dance might be at line B. Now the point is that if we were to model this, we would say, well, we take a circle and the diameter of the circle is the sentence that the bee is uttering to the other bees. A vertical line means fly straight into the sun. A horizontal line means fly at right angles to the sun. And there's an infinite number of diameters to a circle. But how much can a bee discriminate the flight of a different bee? I don't know, 5, 6, a dozen. Natural selection does not require that kind of precision, because when the bee's out there flying around, it has other ways of finding clover. So all it needs to do is go in the general direction, and that will be good enough to capture the behavior of the bee. So these quantitative behaviors we see in nature are not mathematically precise. They're rules of thumb, if you will. Okay, caveman mathematics. And I use the word caveman. I don't mean to leave out cave women, but caveman has a nice sort of humorous thug to it. And we need a little bit of humor in this topic. So I'm going to call it caveman mathematics. I mean hunter-gatherers before agriculture and domestication, but they were verbal, and it's hard to believe, but presumably they were just as smart as you and I are. What they lacked was the cultural inheritance that you and I profit from. Now, it's conceivable, of course, that there are differences in intelligence, but we'll take it as quite plausible that they are just as smart as you and I, and they're verbal. So, but they haven't had the advantages of culture. So they have the same pre-verbal quantification skills that other animals do. That is, they can be sensitive to time and distance and weight and so on. But because humans are long-lived species relative to many other animals, most other animals, with long adolescences, the skills don't need to be innate. And we seem not to have the same repertoire of innate behavior as other organisms. Second, humans are bipedal. We walk on our feet. Most animals, most quadrupeds, use all 4 legs in locomotion. But what this means for humans is that our hands are free to do arbitrary stuff. And so we get involved with things more easily than other organisms because we have these sort of extra appendages that have nothing to do as we're running away from the saber-toothed tiger. And so this would, these combinations would facilitate the development of traditions and things that are passed on from one person to another. It facilitates imitation and things like tool making and so on. And we have big brains. So what's the importance of having a big brain? Well, one possibility is that big brains were necessary for the development of verbal behavior. That's just a hypothesis. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. People don't really know why big brains developed, but one, I think quite a plausible interpretation is that the extra stuff up there permits a greater sensitivity to multiple control and conditional control. And that means that humans would be sensitive to many things simultaneously, rather than just being under the control of one dominant contingency. They're sensitive to all the special conditions that are in effect at any one time. So behavior would be conditional upon the confluence of a number of variables. So, for example, if you're hunting gazelles, you can get closer to the gazelle if the wind is in your face, because the gazelles can't sniff you out. If you are driving your gazelles into a cul-de-sac, you can take your time. You can file your fingernails or whistle Mozart or something as you're doing it, because they can't escape. You might figure out that the force of a rock as it hits the ground is greater the higher it is. So you can experiment with dropping rocks, and the higher you drop it, the bigger the force. You would pick up the fact that size and weight are correlated, and that the length of a lever is relevant for moving rocks, something which is true even for 21st century behavior analysts. The length of a handle on a tool is highly relevant. If the handle is really, really long, then it becomes almost impossible to move. But if it's really short, it doesn't give you much advantage. But a handle that's within the sort of range of your strength to wield it can increase the force of a blow dramatically. So if you make a stone axe with a 3-foot handle on it, you can really land a whack on a mastodon. So those kinds of things must have, or were perhaps advantages that accrued to humans as a result of sensitivity to multiple control. The speed of a projectile increases its force. So an arrow shot from a bow penetrates much more deeply than a spear thrown at a hide. The point on a tool concentrates a force. The force per square inch of a point is tremendous. The force per square inch on a flat surface is relatively small. So you hurl a spear with the same force. If that spear is narrowed down to a point, it can penetrate deeply, because, as I said, this notion of force per square inch, even though the cavemen presumably didn't analyze it in terms of force per square inch, they figured out that pointed tools give you a big advantage over blunt tools. And on and on. Well, okay, now we come to verbal behavior. Verbal behavior is where things start to get exciting. So any stimulus that could enter into conditional control or multiple control could be tacted, could be described, could be named, could be labeled. And then it can control the behavior of your fellows. So if you figure out that hunting with the wind at your back, or in your face rather, is more effective than with the wind at your back, then the whole tribe knows it before the sun sets. Rules control the behavior of others. They also control your own behavior. You're reminded. You can tell yourself, don't forget to leave your keys next to the doorknob before you leave in the morning, or don't forget to sharpen your arrow before you head off hunting. It spreads rapidly, and it can accumulate across generations. So verbal behavior is a tremendous advance for organisms in a culture, organisms who live with their fellows in communities through generations. Because lucky variations get preserved and passed on. And when I say lucky variations, I mean lucky variations, because presumably cavemen are no better than you and I at math, and they stumbled on these laws of nature, if you will. They didn't analyze them in their classrooms. They didn't have drafting boards with pen and pencil and so on to write these things out. They stumbled on these contingencies, favorable contingencies, and then they passed them on to their fellows. A terrific advance over other organisms. So verbal quantification. So allocating time, the rearing of young, the food gathering, migrations, and so on. Time is an important variable if you're living close to nature. Winter is coming, and the crops are only going to be the food sources are going to be all passed on after a few weeks. With hunting, you have to time and coordinate an attack on an animal. And animals typically run faster than we do, so it requires cooperation and sensitivity to distance and the force of your weaponry. So any quantification that you can pass on or communicate with your fellows is helpful. Estimating effort, how much can we carry, how far can we carry it. We have to migrate to escape the glacier or to approach the water hole or something. Duration, distance, relative sizes, and so on. And again, verbal quantification can be preserved across generations and refined by consensus. Now we come to the emergence of extended measurements. The things we've been talking about so far are things that are in the stimulus. That is, the distance to an object can be determined to some extent by the angular distance of the or size of that object in your visual field. It's far away. When it's far away, it looks tiny. When it's really close, it looks big. So you can see, in a sense, how distant something is, assuming you know how big it is, by its angular size or the texture of the visual field. You can see that this rock is big and this rock is small. So this rock is going to be heavy, perhaps too heavy to lift. This one is going to be small, easy to lift. So, and with duration, we're able to sense whether something happened just a little moment ago or a long time ago, without any kind of record keeping or something, because the stimulus is so to speak there to be apprehended with our senses. But a lot of quantitative things don't have stimulus properties, like days. Someone goes away for 3 days. When you look out of your teepee and look around, you can't tell by the physical scene around you how many days have elapsed since something else occurred. Because the lapse of time of that sort doesn't have stimulus properties. Within a day, however, you can look at the sun. If the sun is down there, it's late in the day. If the sun is up there, it's noon, and so on. So there are stimulus properties that can be sort of immediately apprehended, but examples where they cannot. That is, the stimulus is not in the quantity is not represented in the stimulus. So we can measure time and duration using markers like the length of a beard, or the wrinkling of an adult's face, or maturation of children, the height of a tree, the height of a plant, the fruiting of a crop, and so on. The fatigue when you're walking, healing of wounds, how long it takes a pile of wood to burn to ashes. These are examples of markers that represent the passage of time and can be used as a kind of number, if you will. My beard is down to my belly button, so it must have been a long time since I shaved. Not that cavemen shaved, but distance distance can be sort of apprehended immediately in the stimulus within the visual field, but if you have to go beyond the horizon for something, then distance can't be determined. You have to use things like landmarks. So you have to get to the water hole, you need to go beyond the big mountain. Which is heavier, 10-foot pole or 12-inch boulder? Is it farther to the great meadow or to the water hole? These are things where some kind of record keeping or markers or some tacting of quantity would come into play. So numerosity beyond 1, 2, 3, many. How large is the tribe? How many children are there? How productive is the blueberry bush? How large is the approaching force? So these would be contingencies that would shape up some kind of verbal quantification, some kind of marker to represent these quantities. And verbal quantification would guide much more effective action. So it provides more precise control than just some kind of intuition or common sense. So if I say it's a 4 days walk to the next water hole, that's much more, that controls behavior much more precisely and effectively than just saying, oh, it's a long way to the water hole. So any kind of verbal behavior that can mark these quantitative relationships would be selected for. There's 17 warriors approaching. Well, that's a heck of a lot more informative than saying there's a tribe of the bad guys coming, the Neanderthals are on their way. Well, knowing how many there are, quantifying it with some kind of verbal marker would be extremely beneficial to a caveman. It'll take us a month to move our camp to the top of the bluff by the river. Well, again, that's good to know, because you don't want to wait until it's too late, until the snows come. You want to get there, perhaps you don't want to get there, I don't know, but knowing the duration of time, having some kind of marker for time would be very helpful. 12 men can carry a mastodon carcass on level ground. Well, if you've only got 11 men in your tribe, then you're going to have to figure out some other way of getting that mastodon back home, cut it up into pieces, I guess. So what kinds of verbal quantification are there? as I just mentioned, there's tacting, labeling or verbally identifying the quantitative variable by number or some kind of representation of distance or time would be a tact. Tacting of the relationships are also going to be important in this caveman society. That is, we want to know temporal relationships like before or next or after, past, future, the duration. We want to know the physical relations. Is it near? Is it far? Is it above? Is it below? Is it adjacent? Is it heavy? Is it light? Is it dense? So texts of relationships would be shaped up, as well as texts of these markers of quantity. Counting. We've already alluded to counting a little bit. The quantification of integer variables, that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, many. Now, some Amazon tribes are said not to have numbers beyond 3 or 5 or something like that. That is, they count up to 5, and anything beyond that is just many. But and that might be good enough. Obviously, it is good enough in the Amazon jungle for these particular tribes. Nevertheless, there would be contingencies favoring more going beyond that. Whether those contingencies led to the development of a system or not is a matter of chance. Estimating the quantification of continuous variables. So something's going to be counted, but the size of a mountain or a heap of grain or a bushel of berries. Well, berries could be counted, but in bushels you would probably want to estimate them in some other way. That is, we have different ways of measuring variables depending on whether they come in little pieces or not. So this presumably led to extraction of practical rules of thumb. I don't know at what point these things were discovered, of course. Levers, wheels, wedges, tool making, building of structures, flotation. At some point, these cultures learned that they could pass across water by building canoes or boats that were lighter than, or that were cupped in such a way that they did not sink. The sharpening of stimulus control by dividing continuous variables into categories. So seasons of the year, for example, time is a continuous variable, but even today, we divide them into spring, summer, autumn, winter, or January, February, March, April, May, and so on. Morning, afternoon, evening, these divisions are shaped up by just contingencies of reinforcement, sharpening the stimulus control. So all of these are shaped up by the conventions of a verbal community, and it depends upon the local contingencies what they are. The quantification must have been approximate. Just as I said in the case of animals, humans are animals too, the natural contingencies are generally crude. So if you go out hunting twice as often as you did last week, it doesn't mean you're going to catch twice as much game. You might come back with 1.5 as much. You might come back with 2/3 as much, even though you hunted twice as often. That is, the natural contingencies are so variable that they would not necessarily shape up highly precise quantification. If it takes you a day to get up the mountain, how long will it take you to get back down the mountain? Well, not a day. You can get down a mountain a heck of a lot faster than you can get up the mountain. So the constancy is not, the contingencies aren't constant enough to select terribly precise quantification. So I pick a lot of blueberries. I have blueberries all over my property. And some bushes are highly productive, some are less productive. If I had to use the bush as a unit, it would be a very, very crude estimate of quantity. Then there's uncontrolled variability. These societies didn't have science as we know it, of course. I mean, obviously. They had their own primitive science, such as it was, but they had very little control over the environment, and so there was no way of making the quantification more practical or more precise. Natural phenomena are intrinsically variable. They lack standardization. Their tools are primitive in accuracy, reliability, and validity. So even something like using the rotation of the Earth, which is highly reliable. The rotation of the Earth is extremely reliable as a measurement tool. But our senses don't directly see the rotation of the Earth. What we see is the sun coming up and the sun going down and so on. But that changes a little bit from day to day because the Earth is moving around the sun, and so the sun doesn't always come up in the same place. It doesn't stay in the sky for the same length of time, and so on. So the tools of people in these societies must have been approximate. And now we come to our first sort of mathematical concept. Even for cavemen, there must have been two kinds of measurement that emerged. Some variables, we've already alluded to this a little bit, some variables are continuous. They change imperceptibly. So the movement of the sun goes across the sky. Of course, we know the Earth moves, but anyway, perceptually, the sun moves across the sky. But if you look at the sun, you shouldn't really look at the sun, but if you look at the sun through dark glasses, I'm sure the cavemen wore dark glasses, you can't see the sun actually moving. You can see, well, it's a little bit further than it was a while back, but you don't see the movement of the moon, the stars, and the planets, and so on. Plants grow, and they grow continuously, but you can't see the growth. They don't go boing like that. Sometimes it seems as though your tomatoes have grown overnight, and maybe they did, but you don't see the growth of a plant. You don't see the growth of a beard. You don't see the child growing larger and larger, moment to moment in time, in little discriminable steps. The rising of the tides, the wearing of pathways, the distance to a target, all these things are continuous variables. And we usually estimate these because the contingencies don't shape up very precise increments of continuous variables. As I mentioned earlier, morning, noon, afternoon, evening, we break up the 4 parts of the day into 4 categories, but that's a pretty crude measurement of something which is changing continuously. So we have estimates of continuous variables. But some variables are discrete. They jump from one value to the next. So the number of eggs that you have in a clutch, the number of arrowheads you have in your quiver, the number of people in your tribe, the number of mastodons thundering through the valley, the number of pots that you've made to store your water. These are discrete variables because they jump from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And they can be quantified by physical symbols like tick marks. So you put a little slash on the wall of the cave to indicate that a day has gone by and so on. So this many days have elapsed since Thag left for the hunting grounds. Every morning the kids wake up and put another slash mark on the wall. Beads on a string can be used to keep track of number without having a number system, a counting system. Every day you add another bead to the string. Every time you see a mastodon, you put another bead on the string. And beads on a string are better than just piling stones in a bowl, because stones in a bowl don't have order. It's hard to compare two bowls full of stones in terms of size and quantity, whereas beads on a string, you can lay them next to one another and see which is more. So some kind of primitive marking system for counting. So discrete variables jump from one value to the next. You can have 3 children or 4 children, but not 3.5 children. A chicken can lay 5 eggs a week, but not 4.75 eggs last week. Now, we think, well, these are the whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Well, discrete variables don't have to be whole numbers. At least in cultures, they aren't. For example, if you go into a shoe store and you try on a size 9.5 shoe, and it's a little tight, so you say, well, I'll try a size 10. And the 10 is a little bit loose. You say, I'd like a size 9.75, please. The shoe store owner is going to say, baloney, there's no such thing as a 9.75 shoe. They come in 9.5, 10, 10.5, 11. The shoe sizes are discrete. Same with shirt sizes. You can go and buy a small, medium, large. You can't get all the ranges in between. So it doesn't necessarily have to be whole numbers, but whole numbers are by far the most common example of discrete variables. With continuous variables, there's no next number. There's no identifiable next number or next quantity, next value in the sequence. So if you were once 67 inches tall and are now 68 inches tall, presumably you went between 67 and 68 continuously. That is, there was a time at which you were 67 and a half, 67 and 3/4, 67 and 7/8, and so on. If you were 67.666 inches tall, and later on you were perhaps 67.66617 inches tall. And I think we all have an intuitive idea of continuity. We can represent continuous variables by a line. A line is continuous. And 67.6666 can be represented on that line by measuring 67.666 inches and putting a dot there. Discrete variables can be represented by a row of points. So you have 1 child, you have 2 children, 3 children, 4 children, but never in between. There's no 3.5 children in there. So these two kinds of quantities are represented in these very, very early contingencies. Tasks of discrete variables are under control of discrete stimuli or discrete responses to stimuli. So if there are 4 boys out there, we can maybe visually apprehend them without any counting as 4, because with small quantities of things, we can see the difference between 4 and the difference between 3 in a sort of visual way without any kinds of additional behavior. Or it may be under the control of the interverbal response 4. There's a boy there, there's 1 boy, there's 2 boys, there's 3 boys, and where's anyone else? Oh, there's a 4th boy. So the interverbal response is controlling the response 4. Tasks of continuous variables are shaped up by discrimination training. So someone is either short, medium, tall, light, heavy, humongous, morning, noon, evening, night, and so on, early, late. Distance is you're either right here, you're nearby, or you're far away. Age, you go through stages of infancy, child, lad, young man, and so on. So we have these categorical terms for continuous variables, but we have much more precise terms for discrete variables. Responding to continuous variables is necessarily approximate. It requires consistent contingencies to shape up verbal behavior with respect to continuous variables. So if you were in the business of discriminating between a sheaf of wheat that is so big and a sheaf of wheat that is too big to be wrapped up or carried by a human, that is, you might get good at discriminating sizes if you did it a lot. I can't think of an example off the top of my head where that would be true, but I'm sure that there are many examples where people get very good at estimating continuous variables, probably weight. If you're weighing out, weighing flour into a bowl, as I said earlier, Grandma used to just pour the flour into the bowl without measuring, and then add a little yeast and a little salt and so on, because her vast experience with flour enabled her to discriminate between too much flour, too little flour, and just right flour. The Goldilocks contingencies. And the classes of behavior don't correspond to classes of stimuli. That is, a big pile of sand is discriminably different from a small pile of sand, but quantifying that is not easy. Take away a pailful and you still have a big pile of sand. But responding to discrete variables can be precise. Okay, so continuous changes often can't be discriminated. Discrete changes are usually relatively easily discriminated. Discrete and continuous are in the contingencies and don't necessarily reflect truths of nature. So is nature fundamentally discrete, or is it fundamentally continuous? Well, I don't know the answers to this, but let's take a person drinking a glass of water. Now, this person weighs 130 pounds, and someone says, "Would you like some water?" And the person says, "Sure, give me some water." So the person starts to drink the water, and her weight rises from 130 pounds. She's drinking exactly 1 pint of water. It rises from 130 pounds to 131 pounds. Does it rise continuously between 130 and 131? Well, someone who's really pedantic would say, no, 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 no. The molecule of water, this woman can't drink less than a molecule of water. And molecules are discrete. There are 23 times, no, 1 times 10 to the 23rd molecules of water in this mole of water that she's drinking. And so her weight is actually going up in discrete increments. Well, I don't have anything to say about that. I don't know whether nature is fundamentally continuous or fundamentally discrete. That's not at issue. What's at issue is the contingencies that govern our lives. And at the level of our perceptual ability, there are variables that are continuous and variables that are discrete. And of course, that depends on our perceptual abilities. As we age, our senses tend to dull, and so you may be able to discriminate that there are 2 dots there, whereas to me it's just a single dot. So it depends on our sensory apparatus to some extent. I won't get into these other things. Okay, so now we're going to make a transition to precise quantification. The contingencies we described so far led to rules of thumb that must have been in effect for many thousands of years. If we think of human evolution as beginning, well, let's just say 100,000 years ago as a convenient landmark. Presumably we go back further than that as a species, but let's just say 100,000 years. When did people start getting good at quantification? Well, presumably the cavemen were quite good at hunting and fishing and gathering and so on, and all the contingencies of their lives. But the more precise quantification must have happened relatively suddenly in recent cultural history. So what contingencies led to the relatively objective rules of logic and math, and how did they arise from the rules of thumb? Okay, this is an important landmark in my presentation. When the first Barter came along, this is a point at which a whole bunch of new contingencies came into effect, or must have come into effect. I wasn't there, but it must be the case that when people started to trade, quantification became really important. So sharing with the expectation of reciprocation is something, it's a primitive form of barter. And this is something you see in animal species even, I mean non-human animals. But barter is a more formal kind of arrangement. And it must have arisen fairly early because specialization must have been a characteristic of even these early hominid cultures. Bork is a mighty hunter, Thag makes good pots, Zog is skilled at making arrowheads. So there must have been an exchange among these commodities according to people's skills. But only when it became systematic would there be a real drive for quantification. So the trading of commodities between tribes or between cultures must surely have been a very important point. And this is the first technological advance that I want to bring forward, the balance scale. Now this is made out of metal. It's something I downloaded off the web. This is not what the balance scales looked like 5,000 years ago. But balance scales are a technological advance that allow for trading things that are equal to one another. Why is it the symbol for justice? Why does justice have a blindfold on and the scales in her hand? Because the idea of a balanced scale is that they're equal. They're equal justice under the law. People get what they deserve, not more, not less. So the concept of equality. Barter is about trading one thing for another of equal value. Both within and across things, kinds of things that are presumably equal in reinforcement. Now, people are highly sensitive to fairness and being cheated. And I went to a talk yesterday by Tim Hackenberg on social behavior, and he mentioned this very fact, how sensitive people are to fairness. And I want to give you the anecdote of the parking meter. I live in a small town in Massachusetts, and I'm a strong believer in paying my local taxes, because local taxes, they go to plowing the roads, and they go to paying the teacher who's teaching my kids, and the fireman who comes and carries me down the ladder from the burning house and so on. Every penny of my local taxes goes into the town budget, and I can look at that town budget, every line, and I might quibble about whether the chief of police is being paid too much, but it's small potatoes. Everything in local taxes is good. Or if it's not good, you can gripe about it, and we give a little. I pay for your kid to go to school now because my kids are grown up. I don't care about schools. No. There's a social contract where we all pay our share. Now, parking meters pay into the local fund as well. Now, I'm a good citizen of the town, and if a letter goes out and says, "Oh my gosh, the furnace in the library is on the blink. We need to get a new furnace. They say it can't be fixed. We need to get a new one. We don't have any money in the town budget. Can people chip in?" I would sign a check for $50 and send it off any day of the week for the library. But the parking meter. When I go to a parking meter, I say, "Okay, I'm going to be gone for. I think I can go back here in 15 minutes." So I take out my bag of coins and I put in just enough for 15 minutes, and then I scoot off to the store, and then I'm looking at my watch, because I don't want to get a ticket. So I have a horrible time out there shopping because I've got all this anxiety about the parking meter. And so I get back in time, and it's got 3 minutes left. And I say, "Damn." So I walk around for 3 minutes because I want my 3 minutes worth. And then the next day I go, I find another parking meter. I put my quarter in. Bang, bang, bang. The little red flag hasn't moved. The parking meter's cheated me out of a quarter. And I'm mad for the rest of the day. Well, if I got a ticket, I'd be even more mad. But it's this thing about fairness that's coming home to roost for me with respect to parking meters. And it's crazy because the money goes to the town, which I happily support. But it's this idea that there's this agreement here where I get this and you give me that, and we agreed on this. My quarter gives me 20 minutes in this parking space, neither more nor less. So people are so, well, maybe I'm just talking about myself. Am I the only person who has this weird pathology? Okay.
Especially when the tickets from the parking meter and the parking meter money pay for the for the people who give the tickets, and that's the only purpose.
Yes. I have to repeat the comments to the audience. The point is that if the money for the parking meter goes to pay for the meter maid or the meter master who's writing out the tickets and has no other function, then we're really mad because okay. There's an ad on MSNBC, which I'm sort of addicted to over the last 2 years and 6 months, in which two people are going to a hotel desk, and one person says, "Oh, thank you, Mr. Clerk. Here's my $121.67. And the person next to him says, "Thank you for my hotel room that I got for $87.02. The person looks over and says, "What? I just paid $120. You're only paying $87. And that person says, "Well, you don't have hotels.com or something." But the thing that's intriguing is the look on the person's face when she hears that the other person got it for a cheaper amount. So we all know what that person's going through. Doggone it, I want my hotel room. I want it at a fair price. A sibling rivalry, of course, is another famous source of trouble. I once complained that my brother had a bigger piece of pie than I did. And I had my pie on a plate, and he had his pie on a plate. And he said, "Well, it's hard to tell. Let's superimpose them." And he took his plate, and he pushed it down on my piece of pie, so it flattened it out to a big wedge. And he said, "No, see, yours is bigger." So anyway, all this because of this idea of fairness. So a balanced scale provides equality because when the two sides are equal when the scale is level. And if they're not equal, one side goes up and the other side goes down. And it doesn't matter how unequal they are. The scale doesn't go down any further if it's way off than if it's just a little off. the scale is good for one thing, establishing equality. Now, equality is the fundamental concept in mathematics. And I just discovered this when I was preparing this doggone talk. I never thought about this before. But what is mathematics all about? 6 times 8 equals 48. That is, there's an equation there. Equation. That's what an equation is. Equations are all about mathematics. Or mathematics is all about equations. 6 times 8 equals 48. The area of a rectangle equals the base times the height. 4/5 equals 0.80. 2x minus y times, squared, that's supposed to be squared, equals, oh dear, my exponents have come crashing down. 4x squared minus 4xy plus y squared. The distance to the sun equals 90 million miles. The tangent of the function y equals e to the x equals e to the x. Well, who knows what that is, but it's the people with the big brains, that's an important little equation for them. And as I say, it's the origin of the word equation. So the balance scale is all about equations. So Barter required precision and standardization. You could count things for discrete variables, provided they were uniform. So chicken eggs are relatively uniform, at least in my, maybe this is a result of selective breeding, but my chicken eggs are all large eggs. But if I wanted to trade my chicken eggs for somebody's quail eggs, counting them wouldn't be a fair way to do it. We could use the balance scale for equating them according to weight. It provides for the quantification of continuous variables or irregular discrete variables. So we have a sack of grain or a sack of fruit or sack of any quantity, and we want to divide it up among the people in the tribe. Everyone is supposed to get an equal amount. Well, the balance scale is the way to do it. You pile on the grain until it settles down, and you've got equality. It led to the concept of the variable. X equals y. You can equate grain to meat or any other quantity. You can have a standard weight, a 1 pound weight, let's say, on one side of the scale, and that can be the standard for all these other measures. It would lead to concepts of profit and loss. It would lead to surplus and debt, positive and negative. And the concept of relative value, conditional on circumstances. That is, when the weather has been poor, grain goes up in value, and when there's a flood of herds of gazelles passing through the valley, meat goes down in value. So the value changes according to circumstances. The concepts of ratio and fractions must also have gradually emerged, because if you trade 10 eggs for 1 flask of oil, not using a balance scale, but just barter, 5 eggs would be equal to half a flask of oil. So depending on how much you had to trade, you would get fractions of some standard quantity, perhaps. So all of these things that are now part of everyday mathematics of today must have popped into existence at the moment, during the thousands of years in which barter was being refined, and the balance scale is our hero. The discovery of a physical principle. Now, this is characteristic of balances, or it's a characteristic of physics. And by the way, I don't understand this. I know it's true, but I don't know why it's true. And that is that if you have a seesaw and you put a 2-pound weight at one end and a 1-pound weight at the other end, it's going to go like this. But if you move the 2-pound weight so it's only half the distance from the fulcrum as the 1-pound weight, the seesaw will balance perfectly. So a 1-pound weight will balance a 2-pound weight, provided that it's twice as far away from the fulcrum. Now the thing, as I say, surprisingly, this appears to be precisely true. It's not a rule of thumb. It seems to be a law of nature. And I wish I knew why, but I don't know why. I don't know why it's not just approximately right. It's exactly right. And that seems to say that there's something about nature, like there's a set of rules out there that someone's keeping secret from me. And I don't like that. But anyway, it's a physical principle and extremely important. And the cavemen figured out that long handles gave you lots of whacking power. Archimedes, 250 BC, said something to the effect of, give me a lever and a place to pry it on, and I can move the earth. And he had understood this principle that if the lever is long enough, no matter how heavy the object on the other end, if the lever is long enough and the fulcrum is close to the nose of the lever, you can move huge weights. And Archimedes designed engines of war based on principles like this. Okay, so this permitted precise measurement of fractions and ratios. So to weigh out a 1/4 pound of grain, if you have a 1-pound weight, if you have a standard weight on your balance, we'll call it 1 pound. If you have a standard weight on one side of your balance, and you only want to weigh out a 1/4 of that quantity, you just hang it 4 times as far away. And as soon as it balances, you've got a precise measurement of 1/4 of 1 pound. Well, we should take a break. I want to finish this slide by asking this question. Suppose you want to exchange your cow for oil, flour, fruit, eggs, shoes, a cloak, and a spear. Well, you go to the shoemaker and say, give me shoes. You go to the cloak maker and say, give me a cloak. You go to the olive presser person and say, give me oil. And what do these commercial people say to you? Saw off a leg of that cow for me? No, we need a standard unit. And money, of course, is our standard. And the introduction of money, which appears to have happened about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, established a whole new set of contingencies that required refinement of our mathematical concepts. So we'll take a 15-minute break and be back at 20 of. Precise. 19 minutes before the hour, so I'm going to continue on. So this is the first time I've given this talk, so I have not been able to time it very, very effectively, and I have more slides than will fit into the time, but that's all right. We'll. It's not as if there's a natural stopping place for an analysis of this sort. So money. Money is a kind of Rosetta Stone. It translates all kinds of commodities into a common currency. So it's an extremely important advance in cultural evolution. So presumably the unit is represents a unit of reinforcement. That is, we care about 10 cents, 10 times as much as we care about a penny. But very, very versatile. You can change your cow into currency, and then you can change your currency into oil, flour, fruit, eggs, shoes, and a cloak, and a spear. And you can maybe even have some left over to save for the next time you go to town. But it requires a sophisticated quantification system, an arithmetic system with equal increments. So the difference between 1 and 2 has to be the same as between 3 and 4 and 6 and 7 and so on. This notion of equal increments is not characteristic of things like the order in which people come in a race or ranking people by height and so on. So equal increments, proportional ratios, a zero lower bound, and no upper limit. So this goes far beyond 1, 2, 3, many, or even 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 100, many. That is, there's no upper limit in principle. It's known today as the ratio scale of measurement, and that's supposed to be of measurement, which is one of the first things you learn in a statistics class. As I said, apparently Mesopotamia means between the rivers. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Iraq. So from tick marks to counting, you can keep score by marking a line on the wall of a cave, but it takes time, and you have to have a stick. You have to have something to make a mark with. Counting is much more efficient than using tick marks or beads on a string. It's less effortful. It doesn't require any medium. But it's absolutely meaningless without the appropriate history. That is, it's a verbal convention. It's not 100 doesn't mean anything unless you have the appropriate history with respect to that verbal utterance. 100 ticks on a wall might not mean anything terribly important, but at least you could look at it and say, someone made 100 ticks on the wall. So this led to the first math class. That is, it must have been the case that people learned these systems in order to engage in commerce. Now counting, I want to talk about counting as a pure interverbal. So 1, 2, 3, 4, thank you. That was an interverbal response. It's under the control of the antecedent stimuli, 1, 2, 3, 4. Saying 1, 2, 3, 4 is not an interverbal response. It's an interverbal chain. So counting is an interverbal chain. Saying one of those elements when you're given the lead-in with the things that precede it is an interverbal response. So distinction between interverbal response and an interverbal chain. These aren't really counting in a quantitative sense. They just establish unique markers that have a one-to-one relationship with a set of discrete events or items. So we could use an alphabet just as well as we could use numbers. We could use A through Z, double A through double Z, triple A through triple Z. And that would be absolutely equivalent to using the numbers that we think of as numbers. They're analogous to tick marks on a jailhouse wall. I've been in jail for 7 days. Tick, 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 tick. Hickory dickory dock, I learned when I was preparing this talk, apparently was a counting system used by shepherds to keep track of their sheep. And I thought, oh, that's cool, using a jingle to keep track of your sheep. And then I realized, no, those are numbers. The actual phonemic characteristic is irrelevant. It's the fact that it's an interverbal chain with a one-to-one relationship with the quantity that's relevant. And so hickory dickory dock is just as much a number system as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So as I say, this merely reminds us that any interverbal chain is the same as any other interverbal chain. They're not like numbers. They are numbers when they're used in this way. So it's the interverbal order that provides the connection with quantity, the one-to-one relationship of ordinal position in the interverbal chain to the number of items. If we used A through Z and so on, in grammar school, we wouldn't learn 3 plus 5 is 8. We would learn K plus T equals AE. we would know W divided by G equals C point B. And this sounds so crazy to us. We say, no, I could never learn that. Yes, you can. You did learn it. This is exactly the same as 3 plus 5 is 8. It says that 3 plus 5 is 8 is a familiar interverbal chain to you. K plus T equals AE is not. The math would work out just as well either way. But counting items is not just interverbal behavior. It's a much more complicated business. That is, just rattling off a bunch of interverbals isn't counting. That's just an interverbal chain. Counting is when you match it up with items. So if I've got a pile of tomatoes, the counting exercise is actually quite complex. First of all, I got to line up my tomatoes. And I begin at one end, and I point to the first item, and I say 1. And 1 is under the control of the fact that it's at the end of the row, and the motivating operations of wanting to tally up something. It's attacked because it's the first item. It's 1 because it's the first item. Then I move to the second item. I move my finger over 1, and I say 2. And I say 2 because I've moved my finger, and it's an interverbal response to 1, 1, 2. So it's multiply controlled by the finger movement plus 1. Then I move my finger again. Finger movement plus 2 means 3, evokes 3 as an interverbal response, and so on, and so on, and so on. And I get to the end, I get to the last tomato, and there's nothing left after that. I've emitted n interverbal responses, and I say there are n tomatoes in the pile. So this is a much more complex operation, even though we think of it as the most trivial thing in the world, counting a bunch of tomatoes. But it's actually a fairly complex interplay of tact and interverbal. But of course, we don't usually actually line up the tomatoes. And we usually don't point to the tomatoes. We might teach a child to count tomatoes that way, but you and I have shortcuts. We might just look at the items in turn. So looking at the item is like pointing at it, except we're just doing it with our eyes, our gaze, rather than pointing. And we move through the field of items systematically from left to right or top to bottom or outside to inside or something. Or maybe we count as we put them in a bag. 1 apple, 2 apples, 3 apples, 4 apples. The point is we need to segregate the things that are already counted from the things that have not yet been counted. Putting them in a bag is one way to do it. Some things are really hard to count. How many people were at the inauguration? I don't know. A guy flew over with an airplane and took a picture and looked like there were a lot of people there. How many people were at the dance? Well, they're milling around, they're boogieing and jogging. It's extremely hard to keep track of whether you've counted the person or not, because they're moving around. You can't segregate them easily. So successful counting requires discriminating the counted from the uncounted. So some kind of strategic behavior. We can mark them, we can segregate them, we can arrange them, and so on, in all the ways that you're familiar. I'm going to skip over Skinner in the suitcase. But imagine counting bees on a honeycomb. They're buzzing around and they're scooting and they're dipping their noses into little honeycomb places. Very, very difficult. So counting, which we think of as the most basic, simple thing in the world, is actually a fairly complex process. So the concept of number is represented fairly crudely. For a long time, we think of numbers as having a very sensible order that's just natural, 1 through infinity, negative infinity to positive infinity. But the Romans, of course, had the Roman numerals, and we all know what a nuisance Roman numerals are. We don't have everyday exposure to them, so that's part of the reason. But even when we do, they don't seem to combine very easily. The modern number system didn't arise until around 1,500 years ago in India. So 500 AD is when the modern number system emerged in India. And it spread quickly to China and the Middle East. And it was the Arabs who really seized on the modern number system. And we now know them as Arabic numerals. And they were quite sophisticated in their use of numbers. And they invented algebra. And I don't know if you know this, but algebra, the AL is the Arabic, meaning the. Algebra, alcohol, algorithm, alchemy, alkali. These are all Arabic words meaning the something. In the case of algebra, it's the reduction. I don't know why reduction is meaningful, but so at any rate. But the modern number system didn't reach Europe until the Middle Ages, 1100 or so. Now, what's amazing about this, which we think of as, well, duh, this is the way numbers are. This is the way numbers should be, which of course is nonsense. It's just because this is what we're familiar with that it seems natural. But what's amazing to me is thinking about some of the ancients. Pythagoras, 1,600 years before the modern number system reached Europe, figured out that the square root of 2 is an irrational number, meaning that it goes on forever. It's a decimal. Well, it's 1.414 ... and you keep on going ... forever. It doesn't stop. And to me, this is crazy. When I heard about irrational numbers in school, I thought, well, that's just baloney. Of course, it stops somewhere or something like that. Or I didn't really care. I didn't think about it. But the whole idea that someone would know that that was true just seemed preposterous to me, and still seems preposterous to me. Although I have subsequently seen Pythagoras' proof, and it's actually fairly elementary, and I could explain it to someone who cared enough after the talk. Archimedes figured out that pi lay between 3 and 10/70th and 3 and 10/71st, about 200 years after Pythagoras. And he determined that the formula for the volume of a sphere is exactly 4/3 pi r squared. 4/3 pi r cubed. It's supposed to be cubed, not squared. Anyway, so Archimedes figured out these relationships 2,000 years ago. How could they do it without having the systematic number system that we have today? The mathematical accomplishments are astounding. In any case, unlike goods, the unit of money was pure in the sense that while one radish isn't equal to another radish exactly, one's got a little bit of a wart on it, one's a little bit bigger, one's a little misshapen, and so on. A penny is a penny is a penny, even if the penny is a little bit dinged on the edge or rubbed down by somebody's thumb so the face is a little bit obscured. It still has the same meaning and the same value, even though the penny differs slightly from one to another. The objects that we trade differ from one another, but those are not abstract differences. Those are real differences. The penny has no difference from another penny in the abstract sense of its value. So numbers are abstractions rather than things. They're symbols. And this is a whole new order of nature for humans. Or to put it slightly more practical terms, it's verbal behavior, which is also symbolic and abstract. The number system is insulated from circumstances, age, weather, condition. One remains one, whether it's whispered, whether it's shouted, whether it's counted covertly, Whether it's chiseled in stone, one remains one. It doesn't matter what modality or how loudly it's asserted. Whether it's a symbol for, the written word for, the Roman numeral for, they're all verbal responses. I really don't want to get into this too deeply, but Skinner defined verbal behavior as under the control of arbitrary contingencies arranged by the verbal community. And so the control of the behavior of the listener is a convention, and it doesn't depend upon variations in the stimulus. It's a convention that this verbal stimulus has this effect, whether it's shouted, whispered, or said in a normal tone of voice. So it's this arbitrary nature of verbal contingencies that makes numbers pure. You can count indefinitely without having anything to count. That is, the interverbal chain can just go on and on and on and on and on, and the meaning, if you will, is consistent all the way, even though it has no relationship with any practical contingency in your life. It's a product of the verbal community that this number system has this property. So you can add and subtract and multiply and divide without having anything to add and subtract with. That is, it doesn't have to translate into anything. You can just operate on these numbers and in the abstract. So you can play with numbers without asking whether they mean anything. So Fermat was one of the big mathematicians of the 17th century, and he asked the question, is 2 to the nth power raised to the nth power plus 1 always a prime number? Well, the trouble with a question like that is it's extremely hard to answer it. We can say whether 83 is a prime number fairly easily if you know what a prime number is. But 2 to the fifth power plus 1 is a gigantic number. And who's to say whether it's prime or not? Well, anyway, that's the kind of question that Fermat could ask just sitting around his library one day with a pencil and a piece of paper. Is the square root of 2 irrational? Well, Pythagoras says, yes, it is irrational. That's a question that could be asked in the abstract. So how does verbal behavior allow abstraction? Imagine the verbal response, fish. You can say fish under the control of a bazillion different, unique, discriminative stimuli. But when I say the word fish and it becomes an auditory stimulus, you as a listener can't access any of that variability. So I say fish because I'm looking at a whale, or I say, I should be saying mammal, but I said fish. Anyway, I look at a trout, I say fish. You can't tell whether I'm looking at a fish or a trout or a guppy. The listener can't recapture any of the original variability. So I'm not entirely without visual aids. Fish can be asserted, as I just said, under the control of a zillion different variables. But the listener who hears fish has no way of responding to the stimulus that occasioned the words fish. The only thing that the listener can do is respond in a sort of generic way to whatever, according to whatever contingencies shaped up listener behavior in this person's history. So the listener's behavior is likely to vary a little bit from one occasion to the next, but the variability in the listener behavior is disconnected from the variability in that control the behavior of the speakers. So it's cut off. The verbal stimulus, the transition from a verbal stimulus to a verbal response isolates the listener from the controlling variables, and that's what allows verbal behavior to be abstract, because all of the variability is collapsed by the verbal response. The listener has no access to it. So numbers become abstract for the same reason. If we always use the number 4 to talk about 4 tomatoes, then 4 would mean 4 tomatoes. It wouldn't mean 4. It's the fact that the 4 comes as a verbal response under a tremendous variety of things, and you cannot, you have no way of knowing what the controlling variable was except for that 4-ness in the verbal response, unless, of course, the person says 4 tomatoes. Okay, so let's continue with our little stroll through hominid history to the rise of agriculture. Now, I don't know whether agriculture preceded or postceded barter, but it doesn't matter. The rise of agriculture encouraged permanent settlements, and permanent settlements must have led to the quantification of area. So this brought in a whole new set of contingencies of reinforcement. So the contingencies of agriculture required the development of a two-dimensional geometry of area. The storage of grain, flour, and other things must have required a three-dimensional geometry of volume. The contingencies of making roads required the development of the geometry of lines and angles. Ditto for astronomy. Large settlements required the division of land. Animal husbandry entailed multiplication. That was a little bit of a side issue. Building trades required the quantification of the strength of materials, and so on. So a whole new set of contingencies that came along with agriculture. But the one I want to focus on is the allocation of land, the ownership of land, the inheritance of land. You've got 3 kids, and you've got 100 acres of land. And how many acres does each kid get? Well, you could give the most to the eldest or something like that. But if you're going to be dividing up land, you want to quantify the area in some way. So when land became a commodity, quantification became necessary. Now, the natural boundaries of land are easy. Your land goes up to the river and as far as the bluff and down to the highway, Route 80. Now, those are nice, easy natural boundaries, and I'm sure that those were in use whenever practicable. But they're hard to quantify. How much land is it between here and the bluff and the highway? Circles are easy to make. You tie a goat to a peg and let it browse a little bit, and pretty soon you have a circle in the grass. But circles aren't very efficient because they can't stack very easily without leaving a lot of extra space. So rectangles use all of the available space, and they can be divided nice and easily and accurately. But they're hard to make without a compass. That is, a rectangle is not something that you can just make easily without some kind of measurement tools, unless you have a mastery of geometry. And so the allocation of land must have led to the early geometry. Now, the earliest units of distance and area were pragmatic and approximate. Now, this is kind of interesting. I looked up these units. An acre of land, what's an acre of land? Well, it's 43,520 square feet. Or 320 square, something like that. Anyway, well, that's not very intuitive. An acre of land was the amount of land that could be plowed by a team of oxen in one day. Now, clearly that's not a constant, but they must have said, okay, we'll measure it out with a tape or something, But that was the fundamental idea of acre. A furlong was the length of a furrow, so there must have been standard field sizes that led to furlongs. A foot, of course, is the length of a foot. A hand is the span of a hand. A fathom. What's a fathom? Well, I looked up fathom in the dictionary, and I got these baffling responses like around 6 feet. What do you mean around 6 feet? And then I looked into the history of fathom, and fathoms are used for measuring depth. And then I realized that fathom, you want to know how deep the water is. So you throw a rock over the edge attached to a string, and then you measure how deep it is by going, you grab the rope and you go whoop, 1, whoop, 2, whoop, 3 fathoms. A fathom is this. It's how far your arms spread as you pull the rope out of the water. And that's about 6 feet, if you're 6 feet tall. And that's why the fathom is about 5.5 feet, or about 6 feet. Why it's this rather crude notion. A mile, what's a mile? It comes from the Latin root for 1,000. A mile is 1,000 paces. A pace is 2 steps, left to right. That's a pace. And it's about 5 feet or 5.28 feet, and 1,000 of them is a mile. So these early measures were pragmatic and approximate, of course. And the contingencies favored these units that Farmer Brown could employ, but when you get into inheritance and barter and sale and so on, you require a more precise quantification. And that leads us to the science or the mathematics of geometry with these idealized forms, circles and squares and triangles and hexagons and dodecahedrons and so on. So the Greeks went to town with these early forms, and they quantified them precisely, and had Euclid's geometries, big fat book full of little rules about how triangles and squares and rectangles and so on can cones all have these formal properties. So it leads to a purely formal and abstract system. So the geometric shapes are like numbers in the sense that they are purely abstract verbal behavior. There's no such thing as a circle in nature. There's no such thing as a square or a point. No diamonds and so on in nature, no dodecahedrons. And you say, wait, no, of course, that's baloney. A garnet crystal is a dodecahedron, isn't it? Palmer. And what about salt crystals? They're little cubes. Ripples in a pond, those are circles. You pasture a tethered goat, he makes a circle. You just said that. Honeycomb, oh my God, those hexagons and a honeycomb, they're beautiful. The spider web, the eye of a dragonfly, and so on. Nature abounds with orderly arrangements of stimuli. But these are approximations of these things. They're good enough. But if you take out a magnifying glass, let's take a bicycle tire. Is it a circle? Well, look at it under magnification, and it sure ain't a circle. A circle is a set of points, invisibly thin points, that's perfectly equidistant from some center. And no bicycle tire magnified sufficiently is going to have that property. A bicycle tire is going to be corrugated when you look at it under an electron microscope. Am I being pedantic here? No. This is the point. These geometric shapes are models of nature. They're not nature. Honeycomb is hexagonal-ish. It's not exactly hexagonal. That is, if you get out your micrometer and measure a honeycomb, one side will be a millionth of an inch longer than the other side. Because bees, they don't care whether it's a hexagon or not. They're trying to make a place to store their honey. So nature is not perfect, but the abstractions are perfect. And this leads to a fundamental mismatch between the world of mathematics and the real world. So it generates these precise models, and you can make perfect deductions about these models. That is, Euclid could say a triangle is a planar figure with 3 straight sides, and the sum of the angles of a triangle must be 180 degrees because of his postulates about what a triangle is. Now, In the town I live in Massachusetts, there was I don't really have time to get into this too much, but they added a 2-mile swath of land to the town of Sunderland and gave it to the town of Leverett. And it was to be 6 miles away from the Connecticut River to the east, 9 miles up and down the river, and then 6 miles in from the 9-mile point. So you can imagine this swath of land that's 2 miles wide and 6 miles from the river. Well, where's the edge of a river? Well, you know, if you're looking from an airplane, you can say the edge of the river is right there. But if you're on the ground, the river is kind of sloshing around this way and that way. The river rises and falls every time it rains. And where is the edge of a river? It's not like it's a point. But the point is that when you make that map of the 2-mile addition, it's a rectangle, a perfect, pure rectangle with no little sloppings according to the rainfall. Okay. So this facilitates the use of symbols to represent variables. It leads to the roots of algebra. The square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. And it doesn't matter how big the thing is. We let A represent the short side, B represent the medium side, and C represent the hypotenuse. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. The diagonal of a square is square root of 2. 2 times A squared. If a line is A units long, what is A times A? Well, let's demonstrate it geometrically. If A is 6, A squared just means taking A times. You can make a square out of the A's, and you get A squared. So if A is 6, A squared is 36, because you can make 36 little blocks out of 6 A's, each equal to 6. So multiplication is just addition. To multiply something by 6 just means to add that something to itself 6 times. If we add A to itself A times, we can make a perfect square, or A squared. If one line is A units long and a second line is B units long, what is A times B? Well, we get a rectangle. If A is 6 and B is 3, it means taking it's taking the 6 A's and adding it to itself 3 times to make a rectangle. How much bigger will your plot be if you make it 2 feet wider and 2 feet longer? Well, let's let A equal 6 and B equal 2. So now we have A plus B squared. Well, what's this? Well, we can chop it up into little pieces. The A plus B squared is the A squared part plus B squared part plus 2 of these AB parts. And we get this algebraic formula, which many of you will recognize from high school. A plus B squared equals A squared plus 2AB plus B squared. Well, you learned that, you may have learned that as an interverbal chain in high school, but it's simply a reflection of these plots of land being matched with themselves A plus B times, and you can see within it the elements A squared, B squared, and so on. A minus B, same thing. The area of a rectangle equals base times height. It's the number of times B gets added to itself to make A and B. The area of a right triangle is going to be half of that. You put the diagonal through, you have 2 congruent triangles, so it has to be 1/2 times AB. So all of these things follow from this essentialistic nature of geometry as idealized things. That is, it's not true on the ground, it's true on paper. The Pythagorean Theorem, A squared plus B squared equals C squared, this is how you can show it. You can just take a triangle, a right triangle, take 4 of them, arrange them in a little spin wheel like this, and you end up with C squared. And that C squared happens to be made up of these 4 triangles, a half AB plus half AB plus half AB plus half AB, plus this little square in the middle, A minus B squared. And that leads to the Pythagorean theorem. So there's really nothing to it, but it's all based on this notion of pure idealized quantities. And nature is not like that. So early science and engineering exploited these mathematics, and there were new contingencies, the building of roads, aqueducts, walls, terraces, and so on, pyramids, shipbuilding, navigation, weaponry. What about algebra? Algebra is the use of symbols for simplifying mathematical operations. And once again, the symbols are these idealized verbal units that are isolated from nature. So you can say a plus b squared equals a squared plus 2ab plus b squared without any reference to tomatoes or horseshoes or radishes or acres of land. It holds true for any values of a and b because these are idealized essentialistic systems. You can talk about the circumference of a circle being pi times d for any value of d. I won't get into the binomial formula because we don't really have time to it, but the binomial formula is an extremely useful tool for counting things. And it's quite a complicated formula, but as I say, it's very useful, but it's very abstract. It's a times b times raised to this power times this coefficient plus some other things, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Extremely long equation. If n is 50, a plus b to the 50th power, there are going to be 51 of these terms. Okay, what's the verbal analog of algebra? It's the autoclitic frame, Skinner's concept of autoclitic frame, or you could call it an interverbal frame if you don't like the word autoclitic. It's a verbal string with some fixed elements and some variable elements. The verb give, for example, typically entails a giver, a thing given, and someone who receives it. So X gave the Y to the Z is an example of an autoclitic frame. Prepositional phrases are autoclitic frames: on the X, on the table, on the shelf, on the fridge, on the wall. There are lots and lots of these interverbal frames. And as children, we quickly become facile with substituting terms into these frames. So X promised Y that Z, Larry promised Curly that he'd mow the lawn. It could be any X, it could be any Y, it could be any Z. And we fluently, we quickly become fluent in these, with these autoclitic frames. And so the facility with these interverbal frames becomes early in life and becomes fluent and effortless and is perfectly analogous to algebraic terms, x squared plus y squared equals z squared, or x plus y equals z, as the case may be. I'm going to skip over this as two. Mathematics is a system of a priori definitions, postulates, and deductions. So a circle is defined as a set of points on a plane equidistant from a single central point. And because these are things defined in our armchair, it's not that we go out in nature and observe that there is a set of points equidistant from a central point. It's something defined outside of observation. It's defined in our armchair. It becomes a definition that we impose on our system. And so there really are no circles in nature. They're just things that are kind of circular. But the model is very, very, very useful nonetheless. So this led to the development of formal or pure mathematics, where we depart from approximate good enough mathematics. So I'm going to give you an example of a model versus reality. Andrew Gardner in my town bought 43 acres of land in 1793, and his boundaries were straight lines. It was on a map drafted by one of the founders of the community, who said, okay, Gardner, you're going to get this plot of land over here. It's 43 acres. It's 100 rods east, 160 rods east-west. It's 43 rods north-south. It's 43 acres, and that's yours. And then so Gardner went out and farmed his property. And here are some of his boundary walls. Notice these walls are heaps of stone that are intended to be straight lines, invisibly thin straight lines. They're nothing like that. They've been there for 200 years and then some as boundaries of this property because Andrew Gardner lugged these rocks over and plopped them down in a heap, more or less along the line of his property. And this is his property line. The fiction that it's a perfect rectangle is crazy. There's nothing perfect about these walls. Here's another piece of the wall. Look at the size of some of these rocks. These are big, fat boulders, and we're representing them as invisibly thin, perfectly straight line. The point is that nature isn't like our model is a model of nature. It's not nature itself. Our mathematics is a system that we use because the system has rules that we can manipulate, and we can take our model, we can take our 43 acres and divide it into thirds or quarters or sixteenths or something by drawing perfectly straight lines at certain angles. But on the ground, who knows? Maybe it's 43 acres, maybe it's 45 acres. Andrew Gardner didn't know, and no one knows ever since. Even with super duper modern surveying tools, once you get out into the woods, you come to a corner in the stone wall. Here's a corner in the stone wall, this thing on the left over here. That's his corner. Well, what's the corner? Is it the very, 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 very northeast corner of that little chip of rock? I mean, it's just crazy. It's meaningless. It's meaningless to ask where Gardner's northeast corner is, where that point is, because nature isn't points. Geometry is points. So the erratic, irregular, and ponderous stone walls of New England are analogous to the fish that occasioned the response fish in slide 48. The perfect rectangle of invisibly thin lines is an abstraction analogous to normative verbal behavior. None of this variability in the actual boundary is available as a stimulus to someone looking at the map. Okay, so the take-home message is the concepts of math and geometry are abstractions. They're not real. They're verbal constructions. Does 1 + 1 = 2? Well, this is easy. Everybody knows that. But does it? In our math class it does, but in nature it doesn't. You get a foot of snow on Monday, get a foot of snow on Tuesday, go out and measure the snow. It's 18 inches thick. The second foot of snow compressed the first foot of snow. Alcohol and water have a curious property that the molecules intermix. You take a cup of alcohol and a cup of water and mix them together, and you have up to 1.9 cups, more or less, of liquid. So it's not true that 1 + 1 = 2. It's true in our math class. The math class is about models, and these models are very, very, very useful, but they shouldn't be overused. That is, we should always recognize that the model is not nature. A model is what nature would look like if it were pure as defined by our verbal definitions. But nature is not like that. So, the role of assumptions in mathematics. Let's take statistical procedures. There are mathematical edifices or models that depend upon a set of assumptions about how the world works. Without the assumptions, it would be impossible to create the edifice. Now, as a statistics teacher, I have commerce with a lot of other statistics teachers, and I heard a statistics teacher say this: we use the normal curve as a model because most natural phenomena are normally distributed. And this could not be farther from the truth. Well, wait, no, it's close to the truth. It's close to the truth. But it's not true. It's nonsense. Nothing in nature is normally distributed. Nothing in nature is normally distributed. Now, the t-test is a statistical procedure that most of you have heard of for doing hypothesis testing. It assumes that your variables that you're studying are normally distributed. And I just said nothing in nature is normally distributed. So it assumes something which is necessarily false. It assumes that you've sampled randomly. It assumes that the variances in the two groups are equal to one another. And none of these are ever correct. These assumptions are always false. So every conclusion from a t-test should be prefaced with some statement like this: if the assumptions were true, the following conclusions would follow. Since the assumptions are false, the results of the test should be interpreted with some caution, with some give and take. These models are very, very useful if they're used wisely, but they are nonsense if they're used poorly. Here's the formula for the normal curve. God knows what this formula looks like, and I mean, I know what the curve looks like, but it's just gibberish to most of us. I've worked with it, so it's not complete gibberish to me. But let's just say, oh my God, blah, 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 blah. Well, let's draw this normal curve. This equation goes from negative infinity to positive infinity. And this is what it looks like. Here's the normal curve. And the tails over here, this tail here goes on and on and on and on, getting ever closer to the axis. It's a half an inch close here, then a quarter of an inch, then an eighth of an inch, then a 16th of an inch. It never touches the axis, no matter how far you go. So it goes on to negative infinity. Over here, same thing, it goes on to positive infinity. That's the normal curve. So nothing in nature is normally distributed. But we use the normal curve all the time for things like, the height of men is normally distributed. The average person is 70 inches tall, standard deviation of 3 inches. So the probability, most men are somewhere in this range of heights between 64 inches and 76 inches tall. And we can actually use this model to solve problems. So Sergeant Bixby is in charge of supplying uniforms for new Army recruits. But he's all out of size medium uniforms, male uniforms. Men who are between 67 and 72 inches tall wear a size medium uniform. A cohort of 3,000 recruits is due to arrive next month. How many medium uniforms should Sergeant Bixby order? Well, this is a problem for Sergeant Bixby because he's got a practical issue. There's a bunch of recruits coming. He doesn't have uniforms for them. How many should he order? He doesn't want to order too many. He doesn't want to order too few. Clearly, he doesn't want to order too few. But if he gets too many, then where do you store them and so on? So he'd like to know. He'd like to know how many do I need? Well, he goes to a statistician, and the statistician says, well, height is normally distributed with a mean of 70 and a standard deviation of 3. So we can model it using the normal distribution. And the statistician will say, okay, 67 inches to 72 inches, that's the range of heights of men wearing a size medium uniform. The proportion of people who wear a size medium is equal to that gray area between 67 and 72. Some people are taller, some people are shorter. They don't count because they're not going to wear a size medium uniform. The question is, how big is that area? Well, the statistician goes to his calculus text and says, how do I find the area of a normal curve between 67 and 73 if it has a mean of 70 and a standard deviation of 3? He goes to this thing here, and he says it has a mean of 70 and a standard deviation of 3, and everything else in this equation is a constant except for x, 67 and 72. So he lets x equal 67, and he lets x equal 72, and he integrates between these two things, and he says, Da-da! The proportion of people between 67 and 72 inches on the normal curve is 0.5889, or 58.89%. And Sergeant Bixby says, well, hot diggity, 58.89% of 3,000 is 1,766.7 people. So that's how many people are going to show up next month. I need 1,766.7 size medium uniforms. 0.7 uniforms, yes. This is nonsense. Everyone understands. Yes, okay. This is nonsense. But it's not useless. It's not useless. It's actually quite useful, but it's nonsense. Men aren't normally distributed. According to the normal distribution, since this goes on to negative infinity, some men are negative 5 feet tall. Some men, goes on to positive infinity, some men are bigger than Goliath ever dreamed of. Some men are 100 feet tall, according to the normal curve, because the normal curve models our height. Crazy. Perfectly smooth, perfectly regular. Nature is not like that. There's a hump. Most men are in the middle here. Some men are quite tall, some men are quite short. It's kinda-ish, sorta normal. But we don't know what it really looks like. We don't know what the actual distribution of men is. So we use the normal curve because it gives us a toehold. It's kind of close, or it's not crazily far away. So the a better answer would be, somewhere around 2,000, Bixby. That's a good guess. You won't be too far off if you get 2,000. That might be good enough. And that would be a wise use of the normal curve to guide good guesses. So there are very good reasons for being skeptical about the use of statistics to make decisions about experimental results. What the models do is provide an algorithm for answering the question, and they should be taken as in the same spirit as 17, whatever it was, 167 size uniform, 0.7 medium uniforms. That is, a statistical conclusion is a kind of rule of thumbish sort of conclusion. And they should be taken as starting points, not guideposts. Okay, some models are better than others, and the accuracy of some physical models is apparently very great. And as I was saying to Willow during the break, it's puzzling to me. I don't know quite why physics obeys these models so much better than heights of men. Okay, where did this normal curve come from? Well, it came from a guy named Friedrich Gauss. It's the limit of the binomial distribution as n approaches infinity. Now let's, oh darn, I didn't bring my coin with me. I was going to go down and get a quarter to flip for you, but just you can imagine me flipping a coin. I have a coin. I'm going to flip it, and oh, thank you, Amiris. Okay, yes. So I'm going to take Amiris's coin, and I'm going to shave off a little bit of George Washington's nose with my thumbnail. Okay, good. Now the question is, did I alter the probability of heads by shaving down George Washington's nose? What's the probability of a head? 50-50? Thank you. 50-50? Does everyone agree the probability of a head is 50-50? So if I flip this coin 1,000 times, which I'm going to do now, how many heads should I get? 500 heads? Thank you. Oh, but I altered the nose. See, I should have got 500 heads. Suppose I flip this coin 1,000 times. and I get 501 head. I'm supposed to get 500. Did I alter the probability of a head by taking away the nose? Let's look at it another way. I'm going to flip this coin 1,000 times. You say I'm going to get 500 heads before I cheated with the nose thing. I'll give you $100 if I don't get 500 heads. Sorry, if I get 500. If I get 500 heads, I'll give you $100. If I don't get 500 heads, you give me $100. Would you like to play? Nobody wants to play. Great. Okay. Because we realize that the model, the predicted value of 100 is a kind of sort of model. What we need is some way of estimating. So 501 heads isn't going to impress us. Suppose I get 502 heads. Suppose I get 530 heads. Suppose I get 600 heads. Suppose I get 800 heads. Is it possible to get 800 heads by flipping a coin 1,000 times without scratching the nose off? Yes, it is possible. It's unlikely to get 800 heads, but it's possible. Is it possible to get 1,000 heads? Yes, it's possible to get 1,000 heads in a row with a fair coin. But how do I know whether scratching the nose has altered the probability of a head if anything can happen? If I can get 0 heads by chance, or I can get 1,000 heads by chance, how am I ever going to know whether my experiment worked? Well, we need a model. And fortunately, the normal curve, well, the binomial distribution, this is the binomial distribution, which looks exactly like the normal when n is large, because that's what the normal curve is. It's the limit of the binomial as n gets very, very large. It starts at 0, not at negative infinity, and it goes up to 1,000. And this is the probability of each of these different outcomes of heads. And what it tells us is that there's a pretty good chance of getting 500 plus or minus 30 heads or so. The probability of ending up in this region is quite high. The probability of getting 564 heads is quite low. The probability of getting 1,000 heads is way, 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 way out here. And it turns out to be 1 times preceded by 302 zeros, 0.000000, 302 times before we hit a significant digit. So a vanishingly small probability of getting 1,000 heads. That enables us to evaluate our experiment. If we get something which has a very, 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 very low probability of happening by chance, then we're going to say, well, looks like our experiment worked. That's all statistics is. It's kind of a hedging of bets. You figure out the probability. You let your model tell you what the probability is. And the model is wrong, of course. The model is wrong, 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 wrong. Why do I say the model is wrong? Isn't it true for flipping a coin? It might be wrong for the height of men, but isn't flipping a coin different from the height of men? Isn't the probability of a head 0.5? And if it really is 0.5, then this should be right, because this is a model based on that assumption that p is 0.5, the probability of a head is 0.5. Well, let's look at Mr. Diaconis. The assumptions are wrong. Here's what Mr. Diaconis says. He made a gizmo, a coin-flipping gizmo. You put the coin, you put your quarter in this little carriage here. You turn the crank to wind up the spring. The spring goes boing on this lever. The coin flipperoos and lands in the cup. And this is what Mr. Diaconis has to say about it. Figures 1a through d show a coin-tossing machine. The coin is placed on a spring. The spring is released by a ratchet. The coin flips up, doing a natural spin, and lands in the cup. This little, oh, there was a cup there. Lands in a cup. With careful adjustment, the coin started heads up. Always lands heads up 100% of the time. We conclude The coin tossing is physics, not random. In other words, the probability of a head is not 0.5. It's because the actual determinants of the flip of the coin are so scattered when you do it with your thumb and you're flipping in the air and it lands on the carpet and so on. There's so many variables that in effect they cancel one another out and you end up with something around 0.5. But if you have Mr. Diaconis's Gizmo, the probability is 1. So the model is lousy. It's not representing nature. It's a model of nature. It's a model of what nature would look like if the probability really were 0.5, but it's not. So the okay, so the message I'm trying to get across is mathematics is a set of models. The models are not nature. Nature is the real coin. Nature is the real men in their heights. The model is just a tool that gives us it's the best we can do. It's often the best we can do because we don't have access to all the men or all the coin flips or all the little variables that determine whether a coin is going to land head or tail. Okay, here's another model with discrete variables. A female mosquito can lay 2,000 eggs at its lifetime. Now this is true because I looked it up, or at least I don't know if it's true or not. I looked it up. Does that mean it's true? Well, let's say it's true. Let's assume that a female mosquito can lay 2,000 eggs in its lifetime. So we're going to start with Adam and Eve mosquito. And you say, oh, Noah, if you had only gone to Adam and Eve back in the ark, we would be saved from all these mosquito bites. But anyway, he didn't. Adam and Eve left the ark. If all mosquito offspring survived to breed, how thick on the ground would the offspring be after 10 generations? Well, this is a problem that we can model using our mathematics. We can figure out the surface area of the Earth in square inches. We can figure out how many mosquitoes there would be after 10 generations. We can divide the number of mosquitoes by the surface area and get the number of mosquitoes per square inch. And let's hope it's not very big. We would be wrong. Area of the Earth in square inches. Well, the area of a sphere, according to Archimedes, is 4 pi r squared. And again, Willow and I were talking about, why 4? Why not 4.1? No, it's exactly 4. The area of a sphere is 4 times the area of a circle at the equator. Pi is 3.14159, and it goes on and on and on. The radius of the Earth is 4,000 miles. A mile is 5,280 feet. A foot is 12 inches. So the radius of the Earth in inches is 4,000, the diameter of the radius, times 5,280 feet per mile, times 12 inches per foot, equals 253,440,000 square inches. Sorry, that's the radius, So the area of the Earth in square inches, if the Earth were a sphere, is 4 times 3.14159 times 253,440,000 squared, which equals 800 quadrillion square inches. That's a lot of square inches. This is a model. Number of mosquitoes after 10 generations. After one generation, we have, we're just tracking the female mosquito. There's 1,000 per parent. So 1,000 mosquitoes on the mother's side after one generation, 1 million mosquitoes after 2 generations, 1 billion after 3, 1 trillion after 4, quadrillion, and so on and so on and so on. And then the father gets his share. So we end up with 2 times 10 to the 30th mosquitoes after 10 generations. Now we're going to divide them. That many mosquitoes divided by that many square inches is 2.5 trillion mosquitoes per square inch. That's a lot of mosquitoes. And they're all in my backyard. Okay, so what? Every element of this calculation is crazy, is wrong. Wait, not crazy, it's wrong. First of all, there's a spurious accuracy. The Earth isn't a sphere. The Earth is an oblate spheroid, according to Newton. It's squashed at the poles. It's got mountains and valleys and so on. The diameter of the Earth isn't 8,000 miles exactly. It's kind of close to 8,000 miles. But even that, what does it mean to be, what is the diameter of the Earth? If you're digging through to China, you pop up on the other side, where do you measure to? Is it the height of the blade of grass, or the last lump of dirt, or there's an ant crawling along? The measurement is an abstraction. That is, this notion of 4,000 mile radius is an abstraction. It's a nice round number. Okay, the Earth is not a perfect sphere. And the number of mosquitoes. It's not as if a mosquito gets down and lays 2,000 eggs. 2,000 is just a kind of number that some entomologists came up with by looking at some mosquitoes and, factoring by the number of weeks it lives and so on. So 2,000 is almost certainly wrong. But it doesn't matter. The point is that regardless of whether it's 2,000 or 1,000 or 200 or 3 eggs, the mathematics of reproduction require geometric increases in the population unless there are some kind of constraints, unless there's a struggle for survival. So this was Thomas Malthus's big thesis, that there is a struggle for survival that keeps populations in check. And this was fundamental to Darwin's theory, the notion of a struggle for survival. And it can be modeled using this sort of mathematics. And it doesn't matter that our model is wrong, we still draw the same conclusion. The model kind of gives us an insight to this notion of geometric increase in populations if it's unchecked. And that's a truth about nature, and it really doesn't matter that it's wrong. Okay, I'm just going to talk quickly about logic because that's part of the title. The take-home message of what I said so far is that mathematics is a model of nature. It's essentialistic and it's an abstraction, and it's not right, but it's very, very useful, or it can be very, very useful. Or it can be very misleading if you take it too seriously. If you take statistics too seriously, you will be a slave to the model without noticing that the model is wrong. And often it's good enough. But you should be aware of the mismatch between reality and mathematics. Logic is the sort of everyday logic, given the current state of affairs, what will happen next. A bird is building a nest. I bet it's going to have eggs. A man walks into a hardware store. I bet he's going to buy some hardware. A police car pulls in behind a truck and puts on its lights. That guy's going to get a ticket. So given the current state of affairs, what must have happened before? Given the current state of affairs, what might happen next? It all depends on our experience. X implies Y. With different experiences, X would imply something else. So these everyday deductions are a matter of experience, and they vary from person to person. But logic is a formal system, very much like mathematics, except it applies to verbal propositions. So let's move to some examples. It's an idealized system of rules, like mathematical model or Euclid's geometry. All dogs have 4 legs. Fido is a dog, therefore Fido has 4 legs. This follows from the rule of formal logic that if A implies B and A is true, then B must be true. It requires this accepting the notion that A is true in some kind of truth, is some kind of a pure sense. But lots of dogs have injuries and don't have 4 legs because they had one amputated. These rules apply to things like substitution of terms and synonymy, mutual exclusivity, and so on. Here's an example of a table of logical rules. I'm not going to go through these, but P or Q implies Q or P. Not P implies P. Okay. Then there are rules of inference, modus ponens. If P, then Q. P is true, therefore Q is true, and so on. So these are like mathematical rules. You can impose them on verbal propositions and draw conclusions, but they're like formal mathematics in the sense that they don't make any sense under some conditions. You can follow the principles whether they make any sense at all. All dogs have 4 legs. Fido has an injury and only has 3 legs. Fido is not a dog. All swans are white. Suppose a swan gets covered with gunk. It's not a swan. So it doesn't matter to the rules of logic whether it makes sense. The rules of logic are like the rules of mathematics. They follow because it's a formal abstract system. And it can be useful only to the extent that the rules apply to the domain of interest. I wanted to talk a little bit about logical errors and fallacies, because this is much more, most of us don't know these rules of logic. We've heard about syllogisms. We know what syllogisms are, perhaps, but we don't know these modus ponens business. That is, we don't. Most of us don't haven't learned these formal things, so they don't play a very important role in our lives. But there are logical fallacies that really don't have much to do with the formal system, that have to do with making sense out of the world, and one of them has to do with risks. Which is more dangerous to you, a terrorist attack or being mowed down by some lunatic with an AK-47, or riding your bike on Route 5? Which is more dangerous, riding in an airplane or riding in an automobile? Well, most people have an intuition that these high-profile events are more dangerous than everyday events, and that's just not true. The chances of being killed in a terrorist attack are vastly smaller than the chance you're going to be mowed down by a truck on Route 5. Airplanes are much safer than automobiles in terms of miles traveled and accident and lives lost and so on. It's just that in an airplane we feel helpless. We don't have any control. We're terrified that there's going to be a bomb on the plane and so on. Because we read about these things, they're salient to us, and they dominate our conclusions. My wife mentioned the example of putting the town of Leverett spent $20,000 to put locks on all the classroom doors in the elementary school because of these horrible mass murders and so on. And her point was that they could have spent that $20,000 more effectively. They could have put speed bumps on the road outside the school, and that would have saved more lives, chances are, than putting locks on the doors, because the rate of terrorist attacks is extremely low relative to all of the people there are in the country. So ignoring base rates is another common fallacy. That's a complicated one. I'm going to put that aside. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. I caught a cold, I took an antibiotic, and I got better. So we think, wow, antibiotics are the thing for colds. Well, people get better from colds without antibiotics. In fact, antibiotics presumably have no effect on cold viruses. But it's the superstition experiment, Skinner's superstition experiment. Reinforcement follows some behavior. You think, that's my baby. There's an old joke. What are you doing? I'm waving. Why are you waving? I'm keeping the elephants away. There are no elephants around here. Yeah, that's why I'm waving. It works. Having a theory that something will lead to a result and then seeing that the result follows, say, my theory's good. RFT predicts that people will given multiple exemplar training, will acquire relationships that were not trained in the experiment. That's true. They do. Does that imply that the theory is correct? No, it does not. There are other reasons for that behavior for those relationships to emerge. So it's a very tempting kind of fallacy to fall into. And it's not always a fallacy, of course. Sometimes it's true. You can't, it doesn't mean that it's wrong, the fact that it's fallacious. But it also doesn't mean it's right. I'll just talk about the regression to the, well, it's actually not regression to the mean. The Sports Illustrated curse. Has anyone heard of the Sports Illustrated curse? Yeah, okay. You get your cover, your noggin on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That's a curse because it means your performance is going to go to hell after that. You don't want your picture on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Why? Well, why? What's the explanation for this? Does anyone want to chip in?
End up on Sports Illustrated at the top of your game and you're doing your best. That's when you're going to be on the cover of that.
Why are you on the cover of Sports Illustrated? Because everything is going your way. You're at your peak. It would be a curse if it meant that you're really at your peak and you're going downhill. But not only are you at your peak, but all the cards are falling in your favor. You're drawing aces all the time. That is, that pitch that was going to strike you out, the pitcher stumbled over a toad on the mound, and it went a little wild. And the outfielder had the sun in his eyes when he was going to catch the ball. And so you just inched ahead of the next guy because of this confluence of lucky breaks. And those lucky breaks are likely to go back to neutral in the future. And so that's the Sports Illustrated fallacy. Well, anyway, we're out of time. The concluding remarks are that mathematics is the servant of science, and it's been of incalculable importance in that role. But mathematical truths are abstractions of reality, abstractions of empirical truths. And how closely they approximate those fundamental truths, we can't really say. In biological and behavioral systems, variability is fundamental. Maybe the physical world is different, but math models of behavioral events are only approximations, and we should realize the distinction between an abstraction and the warty, smelly, goofy, greasy world that we live in. They're not a perfect match. It's a game we play. We say we're going to pretend that the world is crystalline and pure. It's not really crystalline and pure. But if it were crystalline and pure, we could draw these conclusions. The advantage is you can draw the conclusions, and you can't draw the conclusions from the messy, warty, smelly, greasy world because we don't have all the relevant data. We do have models that are pretty good sometimes. But always remember the sometimes and the if it were only true that footnotes to our models. That's our talk for the day. Go forth and multiply. Oh, Noah said to the animals, go forth and multiply. And they all went out and left the ark. But there were 2 snakes left behind. And he said to them, why don't you go forth and multiply? And they said, we can't. We're adders.
This is session number 73, and the code for this session is TEA678. T as in Tom, E as in Aaron, A as in Alice. 6, 7, 8.